Okay, today I want to talk about how to trust your own advice and to stop outsourcing certainty to other people and other influencers. Because in an era that is saturated with guidance and frameworks and playbooks and downloadable ebooks and templated mindsets and Notion boards to download, just the modern individual person, i.e. me or you, has developed this quiet dependency, if you've gone along with the flow of digital culture at all, which is the outsourcing of your own certainty. And that reflex is totally understandable. When decisions carry really high stakes and very low clarity, and maybe it's a new situation to you, then borrowing someone else's conviction can feel like traction. But many times it is not. It is just delay. And I want to explore what it means to construct a system of self-generated guidance grounded in what Immanuel Kant called autonomy, which is the capacity of rational agents to legislate principles for themselves under conditions of constraint. Because giving yourself advice and learning to trust your own advice is not about your intuition or your mindset, although those are very close and very related and very adjacent concepts. But giving yourself your own advice that you can trust is about a credible structure that you build for yourself, a system that enables the subject to function as an author rather than as an echo of somebody else's authorship. A system not of slogans, but of reasoning patterns that can withstand friction and ambiguity and complexity. So what I want to give you today is not even really a mindset shift about advice at all. It's just a structural correction to how we interface with advice. So what is the structural failure of borrowed certainty? Why is that such a big deal? Well, I guess it's not a big deal. It just depends on what you want. The advice economy, and this exists, the advice economy, and the commodity of the advice economy is advice content. But the advice economy thrives because it exploits an asymmetry. It feels easier to apply advice than to generate it. So this perception is misleading. So there is a work called Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases, 1974, by Kahneman and Tversky. And it's on decision heuristics, where people are drawn to options that reduce perceived cognitive effort. And even when those options lead to worse outcomes, they prefer the reduction of cognitive effort. So advice, when unexamined, becomes a form of what they call cognitive offshoring. So you import the conclusion without mapping the context. Right? Here's what you need to do. Well, my context and my situation, that doesn't matter. Here's the advice. And you see there's an incongruity there because advice ought to be situational. Because advice used to be something you received from mentors who were situationally related and embedded with you in life. Advice used to be dispensed by people who knew you. And now it's dispensed in Q&A forums behind microphones and on screens. And sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. But the overwhelm of not knowing, is this advice relevant to me, is really confusing. So what results from our advice economy is a kind of epistemic brittleness or a fragility in our method of knowing. The moment conditions change, the advice fails. Not because it was bad advice or false or inaccurate, but because it was never your advice. It wasn't derived from your constraints. It wasn't formulated with your timing in mind, with your personality, with your architecture, with your trade-offs, with your sensibilities, your energy fluctuations, all of that. The advice was formatted to sound transferable, but transferability is not fit. So honestly, this goes all the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle talks about this in Nicomachean Ethics. He talks about practical wisdom, what he calls phronesis, which is situation and agent relative and embodied. And there is no universal instruction manual for right action. There's only a cultivated discernment with real conditions and real people and real relationships and real opportunities and real consequences and real cost. So what is the hidden cost that we pay for this constant intake, for creating a permanent seat for influencers and other people to sit at the table, tell us what to do in our own minds? What's the cost of that? What's so bad about listening to other people tell us what to do? So, most people really are not suffering from a lack of information. They're not suffering from like not knowing where to start or how or what method to use. Like a lot of these things you can put together. What people are suffering from is from interpretive anemia. The more advice you consume, the more your internal frameworks atrophy. This inverse relationship. Because decision fatigue compounds not from the number of choices, but from the erosion of your filtering capacity. This like saturation of input echoes Hannah Arendt's concern in her book, The Human Condition, 1958, where Arendt says that modern life collapses the space for reflective thought under the weight of constant activity and stimulus. And the problem is not simply overload. The problem is the absence of pause. A loss of what Arendt calls the space of appearance. We fail to make this for ourselves, where judgment and authorship can be formed and generated from within. The fragmented modern identity, one inundated with competing moral sources and paralyzed by the absence of a coherent framework for self-articulation, is in crisis. The tyranny is not a positivity, but of multiplicity without integration. And so it's a condition where everything is presented as useful, as actionable, as valuable, as listicle, until your system collapses under the pressure to metabolize all of it. And the result is a structural deficit. You become someone who has insights, but no compass. Preferences, but no priors. You're no longer a person who thinks. You're a person who reacts to ideas. So, what's the problem with asking better questions? So a popular antidote is to ask better questions, right? But questions do not restore authorship. They require an underlying interpretive architecture, a way to process the answers to those questions. And without it, better questions become a more sophisticated method of deferral. So this is where the philosopher and pragmatist John Dewey comes in. And if you've not heard of pragmatism, I highly commend it to you as a worldview. But John Dewey understood inquiry not as abstract theorizing, but as a practical, iterative, and embodied process of resolving real-world uncertainty. So Dewey has this landmark work called Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, that he published in the 30s. And Dewey defines inquiry as the controlled or directed transformation of an indeterminate situation into one that is determinate in its constituent distinctions and relations. So the controlled or directed transformation of an indeterminate situation into a determinate one and its constituent distinctions and relations. So in simpler terms, like inquiry is what we do when we encounter a problematic situation, when something is unresolved or unclear or frictional. And through reflection and through experimentation and through feedback from action, we gradually bring structure to what was once chaotic. And this is not contemplation from afar, it's thinking as intervention. So let's break down a little bit more. I think these things are helpful. They've really helped me, these key elements of Deweyan inquiry. Okay, the concepts of the elements of inquiry is shaped by John Dewey. So, number one, what's the first element of inquiry shaped by Dewey? It's situationally rooted. Inquiry begins with a specific disruption or tension, not with like abstract puzzles. So, unlike traditional epistemology, there's no disembodied knower that has to solve the problem. The agent and the situation are entangled, and that's why advice should always begin with a concrete situation. And then because we can assess, is this context analogous to mine? Or do the first principles used to articulate the problem space or the solution, do they translate to my problem space, my solution space? So it's situationally rooted. Number two, it's iterative and experimental. So the method of inquiry is trial-based. Hypothesis, action, feedback, revision. So Dewey shares more with engineers or physicians than he does with logicians in this way. Number three, it's habitual, not just rational. What does this mean? It means that inquiry, and this is huge for advice, inquiry isn't just about reasoning. It's about forming habits that organize perception, response, and attention over time. So it's situational, it's iterative, it's habitual. And number four, this is a weird word, but if you're philosophical, you know it. It's teleological without being absolutist. Meaning that teleological comes from the Greek word telos, which means purpose or end or aim. So it's teleological without being absolutist, meaning that the inquiry that you perform to discover something, to discover what to do, it aims at resolution. But the truth it finds is provisional and local and functional, not some absolute word from the divine. So Dewey rejects the idea of like eternal truths in favor of solutions that work in contexts. Okay? And when we think of advice, we have to think of it this way, as situational and iterative and habitual and teleological, but not absolutist. So true self-guidance should be rational, it should be recursive, it should be friction-sensitive processes of adaptive thinking that assume a few things. We should always be in our own self-advice and in our own self-guidance, we should be assuming that advice must be tested and shaped through lived constraints. We should always be assuming that systems of reasoning must be learned through doing, not downloading from other people. And we should also be assuming that structural self-trust emerges from confronting and resolving real uncertainty, not digesting content and writing it in our journal or notebook. So the goal really is not to ask more questions. It's not to ask better questions. The goal is to construct a reasoning apparatus that works for us in the Deweyan sense of inquiry as iterative engagement with lived problems. So what matters is not just the question, but the quality of habits and interpretive tools that frame what counts as an answer. This is not a mindset, it's an operating model. When you want to learn a language, you immerse yourself in native language speakers. You immerse yourself in contexts that do not speak your original language, that force you to speak the actual language. How does this apply to advice? It means that if you want to become fluent in self-trust, in generating trustworthy advice for yourself, you want to become fluent in generating a trustworthy advice for yourself, and continually put yourself in situations of uncertainty. Don't worry about abstracting the principles out. Don't worry about writing down what I did and translating that into a system and applying that system to the future. Sure, if I were trying to create advice content about how to give yourself advice content, then that's what I would say. I would say, put yourself in uncertain situations, write down the things you do, consolidate those things into common principles, apply those principles in future uncertain situations, and refine that system as you go. But that's not helpful. That's not helpful because I'm telling you what to do, but at the end of the day, that doesn't interface with your reality. What if you don't have the attention or the mindset of what if you don't learn that way? What if the constraints of your life don't permit you to do that? What if that wouldn't truly be helpful to you? It just sounds good. It just sounds packageable. Okay? That's an example of the kind of content I could be telling you right now, but I'm not, because don't do that. Immerse yourself in uncertainty as often as you possibly can with the intention of solving the problems of that uncertainty. in order to develop those habits. When you go to the gym and you follow a workout program, or when you train for a marathon and you follow that training program, or when you learn a language and when you follow that language learning program, like the goal takes care of the process, okay? Goal takes care of the process. What you need to do is act. What you need to do is continually expose yourself to the discomfort of the problem space and push yourself to once a situation becomes comfortable for you and a space of uncertainty becomes a space of certainty, to continually have the habit of pushing yourself beyond that and keeping yourself in spaces that feel uncertain and feel uncomfortable. And then you will have the muscle for advice. And then once you have artificially and intentionally and by design put yourself in these uncomfortable and uncertain spaces in order with the intention of solving those problems, then when real problems with real gravitas and real weight and real consequences do arise in your life, you will have the muscle to solve the problem. The discomfort and the uncertainty, the emotion itself, while the situation may be new, the emotion that you experience will be familiar to you, and you'll have a reflexive reaction to it that is rooted in a history, a track record of things that have worked for you, and therefore you'll be able to approach new problems with more confidence, no matter what those problems are. So the system for self-generated advice, right? The structure that replaces that outsourced certainty, it has to do three things. Number one, it has to surface context-specific constraints. So what are the energetic and relational, temporal, ethical costs of this decision? What assumptions am I importing that don't belong here? Number two, you refine through friction. So what has already failed in this category of choice? Where do I encounter resistance? And is that resistance internal, systemic, or narrative? And then three, reinforce agency without illusion. So what part of this decision belongs to me fully? And what outcome am I willing to own, even if it fails? So this is not the structure of clarity. It is the structure of durability. Advice you generate through this process is slower, and it's more conditional, and it's less inspiring, honestly. But it holds. It survives complexity. So that's where we move from certainty to compression. Because the point of advice, actually, the point of good advice that you generate for yourself is not to feel certain. If you're like, I want to give myself the kind of advice that makes me feel certain, you need to reframe. That's not the point of the advice. The point of advice is not to feel certain. The point of advice is to compress trade-offs into navigable structures. Good advice doesn't tell you what you want. It tells you what constraints you are negotiating with. So when you generate advice internally, the goal is not motivational fluency. You can do that elsewhere. It is pattern recognition under pressure. The pattern recognition is cumulative. Pattern recognition doesn't arise from consuming content. It arises from testing ideas against reality and noticing what endures. It is neurological training that you cannot get from information download. So, to sum all of this up, you have to return to structural self-trust. The future does not belong to the most advised person. It belongs to those with the strongest internal instrumentation and the highest willingness to expose themselves to situations of uncertainty with the intention of solving that problem space. The ability to generate advice for yourself is not a sign of mastery, but it is a sign of responsibility. So stop outsourcing certainty to other people. Start architecting discernment for yourself through habitual action, because advice that holds usually is not the most compelling advice. It's the most structurally earned advice.